On July 4, 2026, the United States officially marks 250 years since the Declaration of Independence. Across the country, parades, air shows, and speeches depict 1776 as a moment of unanimous, patriotic triumph. But if you open the actual cabinet dispatches, private letters, and continental military logs from that week in Philadelphia, you find a completely different reality. July 4th was not the day independence was voted on. It was not the day it was signed. And half the population living in the 13 colonies did not even support it. I'm redacted. We don't do superficial summary videos here, just the facts. Let's dive in. Now, before we look at what actually happened in July 1776, we need to address the sources. Some of what follows is backed by the official journals of the Continental Congress, British parliamentary records, and primary correspondence between delegates. Other parts rely on personal diaries and post-war memoirs, where historical consensus remains bitterly divided on specific motives. So, let me break down what most people get wrong about July 4, 1776, because this is where we have the most concrete documentation. We know for certain that the Continental Congress actually voted to sever ties with Great Britain on July 2, 1776, not July 4th. John Adams was so convinced July 2nd would be the national holiday that he wrote to his wife Abigail, predicting future generations would celebrate July 2nd with bonfires and fireworks. July 4th was simply the day Congress approved the final wording of the Declaration document. Furthermore, the famous scene of all 56 delegates standing together to sign the parchment on July 4th never happened. The physical engrossed parchment was not even ready until August 2, 1776, which is when most delegates actually signed it, with some signing months later. To understand the real-world climate of 1776, we have to dismantle the myth of a united American public. Primary British and colonial census estimates show that roughly 20% of the population remained active Loyalists, devoted to King George III. Another 30 to 40% were neutral, simply trying to survive the economic collapse. This was not just a war against Great Britain, it was a violent civil war between neighbors. Archival records from the summer of 1776 reveal a country on the brink of financial and military ruin. When Thomas Jefferson drafted the Declaration, he was deeply in personal debt, a reality shared by many founding fathers whose wealth was tied up in land and human property. When the Revolutionary War broke out, the Continental Congress had no power to levy taxes. They printed paper currency known as continentals, which hyperinflated so rapidly that by 1780, the money was virtually worthless, giving rise to the phrase "not worth a continental." Now, let's move to the physical reality on the ground during that famous week in Philadelphia. That comes from military logs, commander dispatches, and British naval records. So treat it as a strong consensus regarding troop movements and logistics. While delegates in Philadelphia were debating clauses on parchment, General George Washington was in New York facing catastrophe. Just 4 days before July 4th, a massive British fleet of over 130 warships arrived off Staten Island, the largest expeditionary force Great Britain had ever sent overseas. Washington's army was outnumbered, undertrained, and suffering from severe outbreaks of smallpox. Letters from delegates confirmed that everyone in Independence Hall knew that if Washington lost New York, every man who signed the Declaration would be hunted down and hanged for treason under British law. Delegates kept horses saddled outside the hall in case British forces breached the region and forced an immediate evacuation. So that's the danger everyone in that room was living with, a battlefield collapse away from the gallows. But there was another decision made in that same building, that same week, that most people have never heard of because it isn't in the final document at all. So, what are the parts of the Declaration of Independence that rarely get highlighted? This is where the paper trail becomes clear, and it is backed by Jefferson's original rough draft, preserved in the Library of Congress. In Jefferson's initial draft, there was a long, blistering paragraph accusing King George III of forcing the transatlantic slave trade upon the colonies. Jefferson called the human slave trade an execrable commerce and an assemblage of horrors. However, delegates from South Carolina and Georgia, as well as northern delegates whose ports profited from slave shipping, objected fiercely. Congress struck the entire clause from the final document to preserve political unity. Congressional records and legal documents confirm the glaring contradiction of 1776. Men who owned hundreds of enslaved human beings were writing that all men are created equal. While the document laid the moral groundwork for future civil rights movements, its immediate legal application was restricted exclusively to property-owning white males. Now, let's look at the 250-year reality. This is confirmed history and economic data. In 1776, America was an agrarian, debt-ridden fringe colony breaking away from the world's dominant empire. At its 250th milestone, the nation stands as the dominant global empire itself, wielding unprecedented technological and economic power, yet facing internal political polarization that eerily echoes the divides of 1776. What happened to the men who created 1776 shows just how fragile and deeply personal this political experiment was. We know for certain that exactly 50 years after the Declaration was approved, on July 4, 1826, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams passed away on the exact same day. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives," unaware that Jefferson had died hours earlier at Monticello. Their deaths on the 50th anniversary added a mystical status to 1776, masking the brutal political rivalries they had fought against each other in the decades prior. In 250 years, America transformed from 13 divided colonies into a global superpower. Yet the fundamental questions raised in 1776 about power, governance, and individual liberty remain actively contested today. Was the American Revolution a radical step forward for human liberty, or a conservative movement designed to protect colonial elites?